Welcome to the latest episode of Lean In Leander. Hey, it's been a couple of months since I posted anything here, so welcome back. I appreciate you all reaching out on occasion just to offer a few topics and some conversation points. We had some scheduling issues over the summer and attempts to get together with a few people to produce an episode or two got to be a little bit of a challenge. And then next thing I know, a couple of months have passed and we just haven't sat down to drop the latest episode. So I'm working to take some corrective action there with this episode and reset some of the conversations that we have here at Lean and Leander moving forward. So one of the things that I'm going to point out is we changed the theme song. And the reason that I did that was I started to hear the song that I was using on other commercial properties. It was kind of funny. I'd be sitting down watching television and a commercial would come up for a pool manufacturer using the same theme song. I also saw it on a local auto dealer using the same song. So I thought, okay, that song's getting a little bit used too much, and decided, let's change it up a little bit. So the break has given me some time to kind of re-engineer some of the production value here on the podcast. I appreciate it. It's done strictly for me. So I don't know that anybody else will necessarily notice, but that's my own disclaimer there. So we have made a little bit of a change there. And I hope you like the reskinning, if you will, of the podcast intro. That said, we do try to cast a wide net here at Lean and Leander, and I've rededicated my efforts to finding topics of interest, not only to myself, but hopefully to you, the listener. We'll continue to be involved in some of the more political aspects of the city moving forward. I do plan to have some additional interviews with some of our council leaders, as well as members of the city staff. Hopefully that all comes together in the next few months, and we'll be able to present some additional insight into those areas. There's also a few other topics that I want to bring to the conversation. Some of them hover around environmental issues. Some of them hover around volunteerism. And so we're going to be spending some time on those topics moving forward. So I am looking forward to having that content available for you here in the short term. One of the areas that I wanted to spend some time on is LISD. And for those of you who have been fans of the podcast, you'll remember we did an episode early on where we interviewed several prominent educators here in Leander and got some opinions from them on Leander, LISD, and a few of the challenges therein. Feel free to go back to that episode, kind of take a look at that. That was early on, and we didn't really wade into the issue too much at that point. One of the reasons for that is I'm an empty nester, and I don't have kids who are attending LISD today. So I'm a little bit removed from that issue. And as such, I wanted to spend some time before I wade back in to educate myself and get some information related to some of the topics that come up in the conversations in and around the school district and Leander ISD. It's something that I believe impacts everybody in the greater Leander area, as well as extends a little bit outside of Leander, because as you may know, LISD doesn't just serve Leander. It does serve some of the surrounding areas as well. With that, I wanted to start with the conversation in the way that I started my research. And one of the first things that I thought would be an important thing to take a look at is how are our teachers in the school district paid comparatively to other areas as well as the nation as a whole. And I found some really interesting information with some excellent data visualizations that I want to share with you. And hopefully you can appreciate this. I think it's a good way to kind of see what we're talking about, and I know a lot of people are visual learners. So hopefully this will help with that part of the conversation as we move forward. So let's take a look. So when we start to look at the information available on salary for educators, one of the resources that I stumbled across was the Census Bureau, and ironically enough, they had done some graphic representations of some of the details, some of the information that I was looking for. So I want to thank the Census Bureau for creating some really nifty Tableau generated charts and graphs here that we're going to be taking a look at. This really helps tell the story. I personally am inclined to be a little bit more of a visual learner, and I know a lot of you out there who listen to the podcast or maybe watch it on the various social media channels will find this to be helpful as well as very interesting. I will do my very best to give a oral presentation of the data that we're looking at here for those of you who just listened to the podcast. So with that said, obviously I think this is something that a lot of people would know. I would think that most people would agree with this, but when you look at the education level for teachers, they are among the most educated in the country, yet their pay does not necessarily reflect that level of education. That's all a little subjective. It just depends on, what you pay for those kinds of degrees and which industry you're in, etc., and so forth. But I think overall, when you look at this comparatively, it's pretty eye-opening. I personally feel, this is my opinion, I don't think teachers are paid well enough. I think they should be making more money for what they do. There's a lot that they do in their education career, well beyond just educating the children that are at their schools. So I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. It's where I wanted to start. So when we're looking at this graph, one thing that I wanted to do with this is to give us a reflective level set or reference point. And after looking at the detail here, I decided that the retail salesperson would be a good place to draw some comparison. I think most of us could understand what that position entails. Some of us may have done it at some point in our career, so it's relatable. When we look at the retail salesperson from the education level, there is a pretty big gap between the education level on average for a retail salesperson and a teacher. But the pay you'll see is pretty even. So when we look at the retail salesperson, what we find is about 25.8% of them have a education of a bachelor's degree or more, while their median earning is around $52,100. So when you compare that to educators, what you find is, and this is all ages and all sexes, overall, the education level for the teachers, obviously it's a lot more than what you would see in a retail setting. By and large, more than 95% of teachers have a bachelor's degree or more. When we look at the numbers and we break it down by sex, you're going to see that holds true without any exception. Where the salary differentials are, again, it's a different story. So again, starting here at our relatable retail salesperson who's making $52,000 a year, a middle or elementary school teacher is making around $53,800. So really just about $1,700 more than a retail salesperson working in a middle or elementary school. When we look at the high school level, it's a little bit more pronounced as far as the difference. Around $57,840 on average for high school teachers. Comparatively, that's about $5,500, give or take, more than the retail salesperson. But again here, the point of this is to kind of just draw the comparison so that you can see that, teachers are getting paid about what a retail salesperson is getting paid. To help understand this graph a little bit before I forget, the red dot is the high school teachers. The orange dot that you see is elementary and middle school teachers. Yellow dots you see on this particular graph are other teachers and instructors, so like college, maybe trade schools, things of that nature. So we're not going to talk about those so much. We're really concentrating on that high school and elementary level. So there is a difference, however, when we start to look at the sexes. So if we look at men who are in education, and again, using retail sales as our level set, in retail, men will make $59,370 on average in a retail sales position. By comparison, men in middle or elementary school are making around $57,000, $57,930, so 58. Let's just say 58 is where they are at, which is basically about $1,300 less than a retail salesperson. So comparison. And when you look at high school, the high school teachers are getting paid a little bit better than retail sales, around $60,580 compared to that 59 number that we were looking at. So it's about $1,000 more. So not a big difference there. Where we do find the difference is in the difference on pay between men and women, which I'm sure many people are very acquainted with. It's something that gets talked about quite a bit. But for our purposes here, I did want to draw it out because I found it to be pretty surprising. First of all, looking at our retail salesperson, which is our level set, again, the reference point. Women in retail make $44,090 on average. That's $15,280 less than their male counterparts. So that holds true in education too, although not quite as much of a gap. When we look at middle and elementary school teachers, women make on average around $56,450. That's $1,480 less than men, so that one's a little bit more even when you look at compensation levels overall. There is a little bit more of a pronounced difference in the high school educators, however, with women making only $52,800 to the men's $60,000 plus. So there's about a $7,800 difference between men and women at the high school level. And that's just based on average salaries. So again, just making some points. We'll discuss some other things on that particular topic in a bit. But I did also want to draw a couple of other comparatives here for us to take a look at. So I'm going to move this back to all. And when we're looking at this compared to other industries, so when I come here to this bubble, it is the Computer and Information Systems Managers, or IS managers, which here, when you look at the degree percentage, it's a little bit closer. In IS, you see around 75% of the workers in that industry have a bachelor's degree or more. However, their salary is $121,400. So there's a pretty big difference there between that educator and that IS manager. Although, if you talk to IS managers, they're going to say they have to deal with a bunch of children, which might level set that particular equation, tongue-in-cheek, by the way. They're not dealing with nearly the same number of individuals, nor are they dealing with the same issues. Teachers have far more to do with far fewer resources, I would add. So again, just drawing that comparison. One other little note here, if we go to sales engineers, which would be salespeople who are dealing with enterprise level sales for the most part. Here we see a little bit higher clip on the education level, so about 80% of sales engineers have that bachelor's degree or more, and their salary is around $130,600. I don't know if that includes commission or not, but that's a pretty decent clip, and again, comparative to an educator, basically double. So let's look at a couple of other things as we talk about teachers and their pay. So this was another interesting fact. When I looked at this presentation, it really jumped out at me. Teachers' pay has declined in the last decade. This is a chart that shows the percent change in the median earnings since 2010. So this also does account for inflation, by the way. So it gives us a sense of where the salaries have gone in the education sector comparative to all full-time year-round workers. Basically, since 2010, you've seen about a 2.6% increase in the full-time worker's salary. Obviously, there was a decrease during the early 2000s, or 2010s, I should say. But that has come back, and now people are making more money, 2.6%, than they were previously in 2010. However, you do not see the same trend, save for a little bit in and special education and somewhat in the high school teachers, but it hasn't reached the same level. The decrease in salary there is quite striking when you look at this chart. So high school teachers are making 4.4% less than they were in 2010, accounting for inflation. Elementary school teachers are making 8.4% less, accounting for inflation. I just find this to be very, very surprising, also very eye-opening. When you look at this and you factor in a lot of the things that you have to deal with when you have small children, I remember there being almost a weekly ask for fundraisers or spaghetti dinners or whatever it might be to help the teachers bridge the gap. And if you look at this, you hear a lot of times that teachers pay for a lot of the items that they need in their classrooms out of their own pocket. Yet they're making anywhere between 4 and 8% less than they were a decade ago. There's something wrong with this picture, and I think it's something that we as taxpayers, as well as parents, need to really think about. The median earnings for all full-time workers, again, have increased 2.6% since 2010. But in that same period of time, it's declined for elementary, middle, and high school teachers, and also special education teachers as well, although you've seen a slight increase over the past few years. It'd be interesting to look at these numbers in the 2020s. I think some of these trends would continue, but it still shows a stark difference between compensation levels for educators. So when we look at teachers' pay and the decline in teachers' pay, what we see is that teachers' pay has declined, as we just saw, more than many occupations with similar education. So now we're going to factor in that education level again, just to kind of show where teachers fall in median earnings or the average pay. Median earnings for teachers rank lower than their similarly educated counterparts, and they have fallen close to that of a full-time year-round worker with or without a college education. So if you think about that, basically teachers are making a concerted effort to ensure that they have the education level, and I'm sure that a lot of the ISDs require it. So they have no choice if they're going to go into that profession. Now, obviously, your choice would be not to go into that profession. I'm not going to argue that point. But if they choose to go that direction, then they have to educate themselves. And so some of the other factors that come into play there are that education deficit that they will carry with them. They're going to owe money to the university, by and large, that they attended to get the credentials in order to educate the children. Again, here, I really, really firmly believe that teachers are well undercompensated. And when you start to look at it in this manner, it really, really, really starts to show. How much are we as a community interested in investing in the education of our children? Because right now we're not doing it. Okay? So just look at the charts. These are not numbers that I'm pulling out of the air. These are from the census. I'd be interested to see how this updates once the 2020 numbers start to get processed. But I find this to be quite striking. Again, it's an interesting way to look at the information, and hopefully it opens up your eyes a little bit as to some of these matters when it comes to where we are funding our schools, how we are paying for that, where that money is actually being used. It just opens up a lot of questioning as to what kind of investment we're making in our future as a country. My opinion here, and this is just my opinion, I don't think we're doing nearly enough investment in that area. Personally, my kids are beyond the education age at this point. They're in the world and making their way. But I think our kids are worth a lot more than this. So we'll wrap up this section here looking at a comparison in the change in teachers' pay against other occupations. This is for that time frame, 2010 to 2019, and I found this to be pretty interesting as well. What you can see here is, using that retail salesperson again, we see that all three professions, high school teachers, elementary school teachers, and retail salespeople, are effectively making less their salaries fell between 2010 and 2019. This is median salaries. So again, we're accounting for inflation and all sorts of other things here. This is just an interesting take on where the salaries have gone over a period of time. So let's take a look at accountants in comparison. We see accountants are making a little bit more money overall. Median average income has increased slightly between that 2010 and 2019 period, where again we don't see any increase in teachers. That number will stay static as we kind of look at these things. So let's find another good comparison point. Let's look at, there's a lot of people who watch television and food networks, so let's take a look at chefs. Here we see slightly less money in that particular line of work over the last 10 years or so. Okay, so let's look at dentists. Surprising. I did not expect this at all. So dentists are effectively making less money than they were back in 2010. That's super, super interesting to me. I was not expecting that result whatsoever. Interesting. So we're paying our dentists and our teachers less than what we were a decade ago. All right, so let's look at something else. Let's look at firefighters. That's an interesting one. You see firefighters are making a little bit less than teachers. Let's do a couple more before we wrap this up. I'm just interested to see what we come up with here. I'm going to look at, let's take a look at mechanical engineers. That's a pretty popular profession right now. So mechanical engineers making a little bit more than what they were a decade ago. And let's find one last one just to draw the comparison. Let's see here. What's a good one? Let's go to veterinarians let's go to water treatment plant and systems operators. Those of you who live in Leander will get the reference. Let's take a look. Oh, they're making less as well. Again, somewhat surprising. But it's just a really good exercise for you to get a better understanding of exactly the point I'm trying to make here, which is we're not paying our teachers enough. They're not making enough money. They're making less money than they used to, and they're having to do more with less overall, budgets-wise, funding-wise, etc. We keep cutting on education, and back to my point from a little bit earlier in our conversation, I think our kids are worth a heck of a lot more than what we're doing here. So, to continue the conversation, I wanted to look now at the actual salaries for teachers in LISD and then do some comparison with a couple of other ISDs in the state of Texas to conclude our conversation. The point I'm trying to make here is pretty obvious, I would think. I think teachers are underpaid and we should probably do something about that. But I did want to point out exactly where and what those numbers look like overall so that you get a better sense of exactly where that argument comes from. As it relates to a few of the other topics that will come up in this conversation, I'm not going to necessarily go there quite yet. But we're going to use this as a foundation, if you will, to some of the conversation we'll be having in the coming months as it relates to LISD, as it relates to education at large. So, with that said, you can see here that a teacher coming into LISD, fresh out of college with a bachelor's degree, would be making around $53,520. Now, this is just a 20-year range that I'm using here, but if you look at the increase over the 20 years based on the salary scale that's available today, it's really only 15% over 20 years. If you were to take a average 3% salary increase, which is the norm in corporate America, I think most people would agree, the salary in 20 years would not be $61,862, but rather $85,632. So clearly a differential in the way that teachers are paid compared to what the expectations are in corporate America. And I'd make the point here that you don't have directors, you don't have managers, you don't have CEOs, COOs, or any of the like without education in the first place. So, just making that point, and I'll let you stew on that for a second while we look at the next number. Now, a lot of times we see the idea public schools advertised on television, and there's generally this sense in talking to people that the idea public schools tend to do a little bit of a better job. I don't know if that's true. I don't have any direct experience, but comparatively, let's look at the salaries, and you'll see that the idea public schools fall in line pretty closely with what the salaries are for LISD teachers. If you look at the same 20-year range, slightly more over 20 years, but again, far below what would be considered a normal compensation scale based on annual reviews and annual increases. Obviously, that's a slanted view. I don't want to presume that everyone would get a 3% increase on an annual basis, but it is pretty much a regular expectation. And assuming that everything else was all equal, we didn't have any kind of shortfalls in budgets and things of that nature, all of that obviously factors in. But the idea here is just to look at that comparatively from an expectation perspective. And again, really kind of trying to hammer home the point, I just don't think that teachers are compensated to the degree that they should be. And in the wealthiest country in the nation, that seems to me to be a little bit of a shortcoming. Now, some of you may be aware of the fact that I'm from the Houston area. At least that's where I've lived a majority of my adult life and where I raised my kids. So when we look at comparative information to a ISD that is outside of the Central Texas area, you see something very interesting here. Cypress Fairbanks being closer to Houston, obviously probably having a larger tax base, etc. But there is a pretty significant difference in the compensation here, with a rookie teacher starting out at around $60,500. Obviously more than what you would get here in Central Texas, but you see a similar situation as far as compensation over a period of time. That same teacher just continued to teach in the Cypress Fairbanks School District over 20 years. They would only see a total compensation increase of $10,000 over that 20 years. You can do the math on that one. Lastly, I wanted to take a look at far west Texas, El Paso ISD, and here you again see the salary range pretty much where we expect it, given the tenure of the teachers. And again, overall long-term and career increase, very similar story here, around 15% over 20 years. So I think a lot of us will know that people don't go into education to necessarily make millions and millions of dollars. Those people who are motivated to become teachers and to assist children in their development are done so for very many reasons, and salary typically is not one of the leading factors. However, that said, experience is something that should be valued, and as I mentioned at the top, these educators are some of the most educated people in our country, and yet they are compensated at the level of a retail sales agent, and the demands on this profession are far more, I think most people would agree, than those in pretty much many other professions, if not all other professions. And again, the fact is we don't get any of the leaders of our country without a proper education, and we should do better here. We should make a better attempt at investing in the future of our country and the kids who will make that future either prosperous or maybe not so much. We can't rely on just the chutzpah or the rugged individualism. You need education in order to succeed in this country, in this world. And without a proper education, we fall short of some of those expectations. So one last thing I want to leave you with, and then we'll close out the episode. Okay, last thing. When you look at the number of educators in the education system, I'm sure you have heard it on the news, and I'm sure you've heard it on other sources, that there is a lack of qualified teachers to fill all the roles that are available. Part of that is due, I think, to the compensation issues, but let's take that out of the equation for a second. Let's assume that people moving into the education system are happy with the compensation that they're getting. What you see in this range of dates, and this goes back all the way to the year 2000, so there's obviously a couple of other economic factors that are impacting these particular numbers. But if we concentrate our look at this and we say, okay, let's look at that based on pretty much the same census data range that we looked at earlier, that would be between 2010 and 2019. And when you look at those numbers on the whole, what you find is there are years where the new hires don't meet the attrition in the teachers that were in the system prior to that year. So I would call your attention to 2011, 2012, where there had been a 10.58% loss in teachers and only a 7.55% gain. So when you look at that, that's about 2 percentage points overall loss in the numbers. And look at the numbers themselves. You had 35,000 teachers leaving, and you only had 24,000 coming back. So you start with 2011, and then you see that each year subsequent to that, there's only a marginal increase through the next 3 to 4 years. Then they're treading water, and the numbers look pretty much the same from 2019 forward. There's very little difference between the number of teachers that left and the number of teachers that came into the system new. 2020 shows the increase, but a lot of that is due to COVID and the pandemic and return to work. So that's part of that equation there. And you take that number and you put that aside in the way that you looked at this overall. The numbers don't lie. The numbers are telling us that we don't have enough teachers. And if we continue to have this attrition, eventually you'll get to a point where the system is untenable and you simply just do not have enough teachers in the system. And as a result, your children will suffer. Your children will not get the education that they're due. You will be paying the same amount of taxes, more than likely, and that is not a good equation. So we're going to continue this conversation going forward. Again, I'm not a subject matter expert here. I can just bring some of the data points. But hopefully this is something that will stimulate some conversation as we move forward. So we're going to leave it at that for the time being and pick up on the LISD conversation going forward. Hopefully that's greased the rails a little bit and we'll get some feedback from some of you who may have an interest in this topic. I look forward to continuing those conversations as well as having the opportunity to sit down with some subject matter experts as it relates to LISD. I'd also like to open up the podcast to any candidate who might find themselves interested in featuring here on the podcast. That's an open invitation, and I'll make a more formal effort to make sure I touch base with all the candidates. I think we have a few more weeks for people to throw their hat in the ring, so to speak. So I don't know how many candidates we'll have at the end of the day. There's 5 positions, so we could have quite a few. Not 100% certain what that's going to look like at the end of the day, and that's a pretty big endeavor, but I do want to try to bring some of the process that we use with Vote in Leander here to the LISD questions as well. So looking forward to that. Certainly hope you'll stick around for some of those, and I appreciate you all joining me here on the podcast. Look forward to our upcoming episodes, and I'm repeating myself at this point, so that's it for now. See you next time.